Hello class, this is Dr. Palmer once again. Today we're going to be looking at the minor parties. Minor parties have been active in American politics. They provide alternatives to the positions of the major parties, and sometimes they affect the particular elections and shape public policies. Our objectives for this video are to identify the types of third parties that have been active in American politics, to evaluate the role of third parties in the United States. Here are some vocabulary that you need to be familiar with: ideological parties, single-issue parties, economic protest parties, and splinter parties. Here are some parties that ran for president or had presidential candidates in 2004. Libertarian, Reform, Socialist, Prohibition, Natural Law, Communist, American Independent, Green, Socialist Labor, Constitution. You know that none of these parties or their candidates had any real chance of winning, but this is not to say that minor or third parties are unimportant. The bright light created by the two major parties often blinds us to the vital role several minor parties have played in American politics. Their number and variety make minor parties difficult to describe and classify. Some have limited their efforts to particular locale, others to a single state, and some to one region of the country. Still others have tried to woo the entire nation. Most have been short-lived, but a few have existed for decades, and while most have lived moth-like around the flame of a single idea, some have a broader, more practical base. Still, four distinct types of minor parties can be identified. 1. The ideological parties. These are based on particular sets of beliefs, a comprehensive view of social, economic, and political matters. Most of these minor parties have been built on some shade of Marxist thought. Examples include the Socialist, Socialist Labor, Socialist Worker, and Communist parties. Some ideological parties have had quite a different approach, however. One example is the Libertarian Party of today, which emphasizes individualism and calls for doing away with most of government's present functions and programs. The ideological parties have seldom been able to win many votes. As a rule, however, they have been long-lived. 2. The single-issue parties. These concentrate only on one public policy matter. Their names have usually indicated their primary concern. For example, the Free Soil Party opposed the spread of slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. The American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings, opposed Irish Catholic immigration in the 1950s, and the Right to Life Party opposes abortion today. Most of the single-issue parties have faded into history. They died away as events have passed them by, as their themes have failed to attract voters, or as one or both of the major parties have taken their key issues as their own. 3. The economic protest parties have been rooted in periods of economic discontent. Unlike the socialist parties, these groups have not had any clear-cut ideological base. Rather, they have proclaimed their disgust with the major parties and demanded better times, and have focused their anger on such real or imagined enemies as the monetary system, Wall Street bankers, the railroads, or foreign imports. Most often, they have been sectional parties, drawing their strength from the agricultural South and West. The Greenback Party, for example, tried to take advantage of agrarian discontent from 1876 through 1884. It appealed to struggling farmers by calling for the free coinage of silver, federal regulation of the railroads, an income tax, and labor legislation. A descendant of the Greenbacks, the Populist Party of the 1890s, also demanded public ownership of railroads, telephone and telegraph companies, lowered tariffs, and the adoption of the initiative and referendum. Each of these economic protest parties have disappeared as the nation has climbed out of the difficult economic period in which the party arose. 4. Splinter parties. Splinter parties are those that have split away from one of the major parties. Most of the more important minor parties in our politics have been splinter parties. Among the leading groups that have split away from the Republicans are Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Progressive Party of 1912 and Robert La Follette's Progressive Party of 1924. From the Democrats have come Henry Wallace's Progressive Party and the States' Rights or Dixiecrat Party, both of 1948, and George Wallace's American Independent Party of 1968. Most splinter parties have formed around a strong personality, most often someone who has failed to win his major party's presidential nomination. These parties have faded or collapsed when the leader has stepped aside. Thus, the Bull Moose Party, Progressive Party, passed away when Theodore Roosevelt returned to the Republican fold after the election of 1912. Similarly, the American Independent Party lost nearly all of its brief strength when Governor George Wallace rejoined the Democrats after his strong showing in the 1968 election. The Green Party USA, founded in 1984, points up the difficulties of classifying minor parties in American politics. The Greens began as a classic single-issue party, but as the party has evolved, it simply will not fit into any of the categories set out here. The Green Party came to prominence in 2000 when it picked Ralph Nader as its presidential nominee. Nader's campaign was built around a smorgasbord of issues. Environmental protection, of course, but also universal health care, gay and lesbian rights, restraints on corporate power, campaign finance reform, opposition to global free trade, and much more. The role of third parties. Even though most Americans do not support them, minor parties have still had an impact on American politics and on the major parties. For example, it was a minor party, the Anti-Masons, that first used a national convention to nominate a presidential candidate in 1831. The Whigs, and then the Democrats, followed suit in 1832. Ever since, national conventions have been used by both the Democrats and the Republicans to pick their presidential tickets. Minor parties can have an impact in another way. A strong third-party candidate can play a decisive, often a spoiler role in an election. Even if a minor party does not win any electoral votes, it can pull votes from one of the major parties, as the Green Party did in 2000. This spoiler effect can be felt in national, state, or local contests, especially where the two major parties compete on roughly equal terms. The 1912 election dramatically illustrated this point. A split in the Republican Party and Roosevelt's resulting third-party candidacy produced the results shown where almost certainly, had Roosevelt not quit the Republican Party, Taft would have enjoyed a much better showing and Wilson would not have become president. Historically, however, the minor parties have been most important in their roles of critic and innovator. Unlike the major parties, the minor parties have been ready, willing, and able to take quite clear-cut stands on controversial issues. Minor party stands have often drawn attention to some issue that major parties have preferred to ignore or straddle. Over the years, many of the more important issues of America's politics were first brought to the public's attention by a minor party. Examples include the progressive income tax, women's suffrage, railroad and banking regulation, and old age pensions. Oddly enough, this very important innovator role of the minor parties has also been a major source of their frustration. When their proposals have gained any real degree of popular support, one or sometimes both of the major parties have taken over these ideas and then presented the policies as their own. The late Norman Thomas, who was the Socialist Party's candidate for president 6 times, complained that, quote, "the major parties are stealing from my platform," end quote.